This is Andrew Ross Sorkin from the New York Times and the DealBook team. Want to welcome everybody who's joining this call. We're calling these calls DealBook Debriefs, and this call is going to take all of us hopefully inside the White House response to COVID. I know that many people, I imagine, are working from home listening to this call. I should mention this is a Zoom audio call. It isn't a video call. So if you have other work to do and want to listen in, we appreciate you joining us today. I'm joined this morning by my colleague Michael de la Merced, and I'm also joined and privileged to be with star White House correspondent Maggie Haberman, who's joining us to help us try to better understand what's going on inside the administration and where this is all headed as we all try to make sense of what the next couple of weeks and months and maybe even years look like. A couple of just housekeeping notes. You can submit questions if you haven't already at any time during the event using the Q&A window that should be on your screen. We should also note that this call is being recorded. We will make a replay available. We'll do it in tomorrow's newsletter as well as on social and on the New York Times website. And as I mentioned before, in case you're looking for a video, this is an audio only call. I do want to thank everybody for joining us. There are about 4,000 people who registered to join this call, and we look forward to talking and speaking with all of you. Let me welcome Maggie. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It's a privilege to be here, and I hope I can answer questions, some of which there might not be answers to.
Well, so help us with this, and I think the big question that's on so many people's minds is really how long is this going to go on for, and what our life may look like. But we feel like, or it seems like, there was a major pivot this week inside the administration, inside the way the president is even approaching this. In terms of shifting both from his Easter deadline to the end of April, but also a difference in terms of the seriousness with which the administration is taking this. So just take us a little bit behind the scenes about what you're seeing and whether you think something actually even has changed.
Sure. So there's a couple different ways to answer that. And let me just start with the briefing the other day, which where the president said that they were extending the guidelines about social distancing. That came after the president a week earlier, literally a week, on a Sunday evening tweeted that the cure can't be worse than the disease. And at that point, the president was hearing from some I apologize, there's sirens outside, which is just constant. I live in Brooklyn. But there were some advisors in the White House who had begun the days prior to the president's tweet from a week ago, saying they needed to start looking at an end point. They needed to start looking at when the country could begin to open up again, because the economic effect was clearly becoming crippling. The jobless claims and unemployment insurance claims were skyrocketing. This was clearly going to continue to go on a downward trajectory. And the president had that in mind when he tweeted it. The problem is it was done the way the president does many things, which was spontaneous, as he was talking to people late at night in the White House, either by phone or some people in the Oval Office, and watching television. And it was not a well thought out response. So he had in one ear people telling him the economy is really, really going to tank. This is what the president had staked his entire reelection effort on, was a good economy. And that was very much in his head. Go forward a couple of days, the president had been sitting in task force briefings. These numbers, although he has acted as if these numbers of projected deaths are news, these are not news to him. They've been shown to him before, models showing that it could be as many as 240,000 dead. But it didn't really sort of process for him mentally, I would say, until over the weekend, when he had conversations with a number of people, including people in the media who he trusts, including political advisors who told him that polling overwhelmingly shows that people preferred continuing with the social distancing measures than even by Sunday, when he my understanding from a lot of advisors is the president had already made, he was going to lines, but people having whiplash about the measure that has been coming to the White House because it has volleyed from one extreme to another.
I think that Maggie may be cutting out, and I don't know if other listeners are having the same experience that I am. Maggie, can you hear us? I don't know if we've lost Maggie temporarily.
I am working with her to get her reconnected.
I think we're going to get her reconnected. I apologize, everybody. If we could hang tight just for a minute. I do think that Michael de la Merced is on the line, calling in from London, who was, we worked together now for, I don't know, Michael, since it's been over a decade since the financial crisis, if not much longer than that.
I think we've been working together for 14 years.
14 years. So let me ask you, as we wait for Maggie to get back online, in terms of the bailouts, I mean, I think one of the other big questions, and I was going to try to get to this with Maggie, is whether we think there's going to be another stimulus package on the table, because clearly, while the duration of this, the president's talking about April 30th, and another question for Maggie is going to be sort of whether that's going to get moved, but whether the amount of money that's been put on the table thus far is going to be enough.
Well, so far it sounds like a lot of people are banking on another stimulus package. Our colleagues are reporting that Nancy Pelosi has already said that she wants to start work on another package. If you talk to anyone on Wall Street, they seem to think that there will be more that needs to be done right now. The CARES Act is enough to stop the bleeding right now,
right.
But the longer that this drags on, the more that more money will be required. And I guess the question that a lot of people in the financial and business world are asking is how much more? And that has yet to be figured out.
Right. I think we have Maggie back. Maggie,
You do. Can you hear me? Sorry about that.
Yes, we can. No, fabulous. We were really just in the midst of our conversation about the duration of this, and then Michael and I, to fill a little time, had a conversation for a moment there about whether there'd be a second stimulus package, but that really revolves around, frankly, how long this goes. And so the question I'd ask you is, right now the president's talking about April 30th, but even when you talk to or hear from Dr. Fauci or, the Scott Gottliebs of the world who are now outside the White House, but commentating all of this, it's almost impossible to believe that this doesn't get extended through sometime at least until mid-May in certain places and potentially longer. And so do we think that the president's going to be willing to make that pivot if, in fact, the numbers push him that direction?
I do. Look, Andrew, I do think that he will be willing to make that pivot, but I think you're correct. I think the president is trying to look at this now as opposed to 2-week increments of time before. Now it's a month-long increment of time. You did hear him say the other day, yes, we are extending the guidelines to but to April 30th. And then he suggested that things would be back to normal by June 1st. That was him setting another far out benchmark that started to allow the public to see that this could go longer, although it is certainly not what he's emphasizing. Look, the White House is, depending on who you talk to, there are advisors who think and have thought for a long time that this was going to be a disastrous situation and have been urging the president to take greater action. The president chose not to. There are some advisors who support that decision from the president and who continue to say, we don't want to stretch this beyond April 30th right now. To your point, if you look at the role of this, the president talked about how this is exploding in New York and New Jersey the other day. He suggested, and correctly, by the way, that California and Washington State had acted faster to do containment or attempt containment, which leads to mitigation. That is all true, but these are not the only spots where this is. It is now rolling, albeit slowly in some places, but it is rolling through the rest of the country. And the question is, where else does the peak come and at what point? In New York, they're talking about an apex at the end of April. That's not going to be the apex for a lot of other places in the country. And so then the question becomes, do they make decisions based on density of populations in those states? Are there states where they think this can be less transmissible by community spread because there are not so many people living right on top of each other as there are in cities? But either way, we're now talking about months into the future. To answer your second question about another stimulus, there's so little appetite for that right now on Capitol Hill and in the White House that it's hard for me to say at this moment that that is coming anytime soon. Things can obviously change fast, but that's not where anybody is right now.
And then the other question I was going to ask is just the president and the administration's relationship with business. Peter Navarro seems to have taken the lead in many respects and is now using the Defense Production Act, at least in certain cases. There was obviously the great coverage from the Times around this ventilator issue and sort of the back and forth with General Motors last week. But how do you see that playing itself out if, in fact, this does get extended and there are more and more needs from the business community?
I think it's a real open question. And look, one thing that a White House advisor said to me the other day when they extended the guideline date to April 30th was, what happens in 11 to 14 days when the president's business friends start calling him again and saying that this is a death sentence for the economy, because that is going to happen. And as we know, the president is very responsive to calls like that. But what it looks like in terms of what the president will do for businesses, I think, is an open question. Look, the president was not a big player in the last stimulus discussion, because his relationship with Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, the Democrat, is so fraught. He called individual members, but just as we saw, President Obama was not a central player in certain congressional negotiations in later on in his tenure. The president, pretty early on, has become so polarizing that he is just not somebody who can help move the ball forward significantly. When this administration decides what it wants to do next for business and what they want to do, I think is a big open question. This is an administration that does not have an ideological through line. So there are a lot of different opinions about what they could accomplish and how they should do it.
Right. But I think, and I don't want to veer too far into politics, if in fact this crisis continues through the summer and potentially even into the fall, invariably we're going to get closer and closer to the election, and invariably there will be the contentiousness around a stimulus package about whether that would be a win for the administration relative to a win for the Democrats becomes much more complicated. How do you see him navigating that?
I really think it's too soon to say. To your point about not wanting to get too deep into politics right now, the entire campaign, Andrew, is so upended right now that it's hard to predict a month out. The unemployment claims today obviously were much worse than people thought they were going to be. Could the president end up looking like a savior to some extent, depending on what the next stimulus looks like, if there is one? Sure. I think that we can't lose sight of the fact that there are going to be just a crush of ads from Democrats across the country featuring quotes of the president downplaying this virus over the course of many weeks earlier this year, suggesting that, we're going to go from 15 cases to 0, that they were going to contain it. It obviously was not contained. And I don't know how much of a mitigating impact that has politically on any credit he might be able to get. What he is trying to do right now is recast the history of this, and we've seen this over several days, as if these numbers that are being projected are so great, and because of the actions that I've taken, we are saving more lives, and this all, both in terms of the human loss of life and in terms of jobs lost, this all could have been worse if I didn't take these actions. I think Democrats are going to argue pretty strenuously otherwise.
Right. Take us a little bit inside the White House. Who do you think he's listening to these days? On one side, it appears that he's listening to the medical experts and Dr. Fauci. There was a moment even a week ago where it felt like maybe he wouldn't, because Dr. Fauci had been out there saying some things critical of the president. And then you read reports also that he listens to Jared Kushner, who's been pushing him in other directions.
So it depends on what the issue is. He does listen to the vice president, who, remember, for a short time was the very clear face of the task force before Jared Kushner stepped in more forcefully. He does listen to Jared Kushner, although I wouldn't underestimate the degree to which the Oval Office address that the president gave a couple of weeks ago, which was widely panned, and then his Rose Garden press briefing where he talked about a Google website that didn't really exist. Both of those, Jared Kushner was very involved in, and that I think sets Kushner's influence back a little bit, at least then. He's always going to listen to his family more than he listens to anybody else, however, and Jared Kushner is somebody who he does listen to. He is listening to Peter Navarro, but he's also listening to the doctors. He was basically treating the expert opinions as he treats expertise from most people, which is with a grain of salt and a heavy dose of skepticism. I think it has become clear to him, as this virus has shown up in multiple places, as the death toll has grown exponentially from the beginning of March, that it was impossible to say that these numbers were not at least on the curve heading in the direction that the doctors had suggested. Look, the president is the only one who can be the star of this show. He has made that very clear for 3 years. I think that Dr. Fauci's press presence, and he did a very interesting interview with Michael Barbaro on the Daily today, but Fauci is very media savvy. He's served multiple presidents. He is a star in his field. That some of those interviews have certainly interviewed the staff, and a couple of them have interviewed the president. The president doesn't like being disagreed with in public. He doesn't really like it in private either, but he can digest that better. That said, I think that there is a recognition that Fauci has an expertise that the president doesn't have, and the president is not in competition with Fauci the way the president has found himself in personal competition with, say, General John Kelly, his former chief of staff. The president is not wedded to any one opinion that he's hearing, and that should be clear based on the degree to which he has bounced around on what he has said on this. So there's a group of people he is listening to, but they don't always agree, and sometimes they will recommend something strongly and he'll still go in the other direction.
Right. I have two other quick questions, and then I want to bring Michael into the conversation. I know he's been looking at a lot of the questions that are coming in from our listeners and readers, so we'll get to those in just a minute. One question I did want to ask you is about bailouts and the politics of bailouts. You've heard the president make these allusions to or comments that maybe the government should take equity in some of these companies. The deal with Boeing has not been reached yet, and it's unclear how the airline deal will ultimately get structured. What do you think is going to happen here?
It's a great question, and it's not a clear one, Andrew, because again, as I mentioned before, there's no ideological through line through this administration. When you talk to some Trump advisors, they will say there are, and in their words, Democrats in this administration who favor the idea that you just described about equity in certain companies. That is a position that I have a very hard time seeing some of the more ideological Republicans in that administration going along with. So I will be surprised if it looks like that, but I am really unable to make predictions with any sense of certainty right now, other than that it is certain that there will be people in the president's ear in a couple of weeks telling him he ought to take different actions, and he'll be listening to them. But what that package looks like is a big question right now.
And the other thing I wanted to ask was just about debt. Clearly, we're taking on $2 trillion of debt in this stimulus program so far, and maybe more is going to come. How do you think he's going to talk about that to the American public, especially as we get closer to the election? Because this is a country that and a party that for so long was anti-debt.
That's right. And it's actually Mick Mulvaney, the former acting White House chief of staff, in a speech at the Oxford Union, or a Q&A at the Oxford Union a couple of months ago, was actually very candid that his party is against debt when they're not in power. Now that they're in power, they've suddenly lost their appetite to talk about it. The president got elected in 2016 in part because he was one of the only Republican candidates, Mike Huckabee was the other one, who talked about leaving the social safety net programs alone. It talked about not cutting Medicare, not cutting Social Security. Privately, the president has said to people that he will need to make cuts at some point, and that he anticipates doing that in a second term. When he allowed, even briefly in a public interview recently, I think it was with CNBC, that we'll be looking at cuts. He then spent the next couple of days walking that back on Twitter and saying, I'm not touching anything. It's the Democrats who are going to do that. So I don't expect his public language to be any different on that, Andrew. I expect that he's going to continue to maintain that those cuts are not coming. But the numbers don't add up, and certainly if he gets reelected, there are likely to be cuts, and everybody in the administration acknowledges that.
And do you think that he's going to talk about increasing taxes or lowering taxes? I mean, right now he's talking about lowering taxes because he needs to juice the economy, and that may very well be the right thing to do right now. But given the hole that we are creating, some people may start looking at taxes as an insurance policy for the country.
I do not expect that he is going to talk about raising taxes. I think he might suggest that the tax cuts that he had floated, that I also don't think were going to happen before this election, are going to be harder now, but I do not think you're going to hear about raising.
Okay. Hey, Michael.
Hey, Andrew.
Jump into the conversation. I know you've been looking at lots of questions coming in from listeners.
Yeah. So we have one question from Michael who asks about sort of the evolving relationship between President Trump and China. Earlier in the crisis, President Trump had a lot of positive things to say about what Xi Jinping was doing. Has that evolved at all? Has that changed, or are things? How would you define what that looks like at this point in time?
Look, it's an excellent question. If you watched the briefing yesterday, the president was much more reluctant to be aggressive about China and what China did or did not truthfully tell the U.S. about this virus at the beginning of the year than, say, a lot of his allies or advisors have been on Twitter and interviews. The president has always been careful about what he says about Xi, and he has always been careful about what he says about China in terms of not being overly critical. Part of why there was such a muted discussion about China and about this virus earlier this year, the president's advisors have been very blunt with me about it, some of them anyway. He didn't want to rattle the financial markets, and he didn't want to talk about this, and he was entering this trade deal, phase one of this trade deal with China, and he didn't want anything to get in the way of that. So he has tempered a lot of his criticism. I don't think that he is, overly rosy in private, but I do think in public, I think he is concerned about being too negative. And I don't expect that to change unless there is, sort of concrete pieces of intelligence that show that China lied. Bloomberg News had a report today suggesting there's a classified report within the White House showing that China fudged its death numbers related to the coronavirus. I think if you see more of that, I think you could see the president's posture changing, but I think he's going to try to avoid it as long as possible.
Okay, got it. And Jeannie asks, who ultimately is responsible for, you had mentioned that there are a lot of people who have the president's ear, Jared Kushner, Vice President Pence, who ultimately is responsible for coordinating sort of the procurement and distribution of protective equipment to the states?
It's a fantastic question that has only become less clear, frankly, now that Jared Kushner's team is involved, because it's created this extra layer. In a typical situation, typically for the federal government, FEMA would be in charge of this. FEMA is in charge of this, but again, because you have Jared Kushner's team over there, it has created this additional layer of people who are both, looking at what's happening with the purchasing and then have to sign off on things. There's an admiral whose last name I continually butcher, and I don't even want to try messing it up again here, but he is the person at FEMA who is ultimately overseeing this effort. The president referenced him, although didn't mention his last name, in a tweet about Chuck Schumer, a derisive tweet about Chuck Schumer earlier today. But this is ultimately what FEMA does. What is at FEMA allocates resources to states. That is what FEMA has traditionally done. What we haven't had, at least not in modern memory, is FEMA having to allocate so many resources to so many states on what is basically a national level all at once.
All right. And so we have a question from Aaron. Is the White House already thinking about a second wave of contagion? Once we relax our social distancing, does anyone think that we'll see another wave of illness? Because that has ramifications for, sort of economic growth later this year.
Sure. So there are two answers to that. And one is they do expect that there could be a second wave in certain places as this rolls through the country, as I mentioned before. There will be an apex in places like New York toward the end of this month, but it will be hitting an apex in other states much later. The big concern that the health experts have voiced, and they've talked about this very publicly, is what happens if this returns in the fall. And one of the hopes, and again, it's a hope because there's so much we don't know about this virus, even though they know much more now than they did 3 months ago. But the hope is that there will be drug therapies by then that can be used to try to mitigate its effects. And the hope is that there will be many people who, because of herd immunity, in some places will have developed antibodies that can fend it off. A vaccine is still a very long time away, and there was a video of Anthony Fauci talking to other health experts. I think it was an internal meeting that somehow got posted on YouTube, where he voiced concern that there won't be enough doses of the vaccine for people next year when it does ultimately come online. So yes, there is big concern that there will be another wave. There is a huge question as to what that means for the economy. There have been questions about whether 2020 will ever be fully recovered, and it's just unknowable right now.
All right. Tony asks, Amazon has become a de facto supply line for many of our households, but given the animosity between the president and Jeff Bezos in the past, how would you describe sort of any communication between the two or between Amazon and the Trump administration?
I don't think that the communication between Amazon and the White House has ever been particularly strong. I don't have any reason to believe that there's a ton of it necessarily going on right now. If there is, I'm unaware of it. I do think that there's a recognition that there are huge shipping hurdles right now because so many people are having things brought into their homes through a postal service or a delivery service, that I think there's a recognition that Amazon is serving an important function. And I think that you are not going to see the president attacking Jeff Bezos right now. But whereas normally you might see an administration trying to work closely with a company like Amazon, I don't think you're going to see that either.
Got it. Gary asks, why isn't anyone discussing the impact of declining federal tax revenue from the lack of business profitability?
I'm sorry, can you ask the question again? Because it crackled at the end there.
Yeah, sure. So Gary asks, why isn't anyone discussing sort of the impact of declining federal tax revenue from the lack of business profitability? Basically, sort of what is happening with the federal government's revenue here, and how much attention is that getting?
It's not getting enough attention, and it's not getting enough attention, and it's an excellent question. I mean, we're seeing it on a state-by-state level right now, as states like New York are grappling with their budget, and there's just going to be a massive hole. It's not being discussed enough at all. And to the question about the growing debt levels, this is just going to add to it. And there's no, I mean, these things that are not being discussed are not being discussed because there's no great answer. And unfortunately, much of this looks like kicking the ball down the court right now. And I don't know that they have a choice, frankly, but they are trying to solve whatever problem is immediately in front of them at the moment, and dealing with the fact that there's going to be a massive vacuum in tax revenues is something that is a problem in a couple of weeks and not this week.
Hey, can I just follow up related to that?
Sure.
Can you speak to the relationship between the president and the Treasury Secretary, Steven Mnuchin, because he's one of the few people that you now see on the stage oftentimes at some of these press conferences and the like, but so many other members of cabinet seem to have drifted away.
So it's an excellent question. Mnuchin, as you know, and as I assume most people listening know, was the main person for the White House negotiating the stimulus with Nancy Pelosi. They basically ended up just working directly together because this was not going to be a sort of 4 people in a room type of situation. And Mnuchin really stuck with it. Mnuchin is up there so frequently, not just because the president does trust Mnuchin, although he remains very angry at Mnuchin for suggesting Jay Powell for the Fed, and the president prior to this virus outbreak had continued to talk about that. And he gets as angry at Mnuchin as he does at almost anybody else who works for him. But Mnuchin is seen, and Andrew, you would know this better than me, but Mnuchin is seen as a trusted face for Wall Street right now, I think,
Right.
or at least one of them. And frankly, I think Fauci is too. But Mnuchin is seen as a steadying presence. And I think there is a recognition on the administration that they have to make their steadying presences known and available and seen, and that's where we are.
Okay.
Okay. And Deb asks, so at the moment, a lot of people are asking what is happening with the elections in November. Do you have any sense of, whether there's any action that's being taken? Does it look like anything is going to change to facilitate that? Or, I don't think anyone's talked about delay, but where do things stand from your vantage point?
Well, it's a great question. And as I mentioned before, everything is upended. So the answer is I don't know. We have seen a lot of states delay their primaries, but that is because you don't want a lot of people gathering in a school to vote or at another location to vote. I think the most immediate question is what happens with the political conventions. And you saw Joe Biden say in the last 2 days that he thinks that the convention can't be held, the Democrats, which was supposed to be in July, that's still going to be a time when people are figuring out safety and health and the spread of this virus. So he, I think last night, suggested that it ought to be moved to August. August is when the Republicans are going. The president has made very clear that he doesn't want to cancel his convention. Republicans privately allow for the fact that there might be some changes in the programming, but they hope to be able to go ahead. Those are the first concerns. I don't anticipate that there will be a move in election day. That would be so dramatic and distressing for a democracy. I would be shocked if something actually happens in the election. But there is this big question about, will there be a vote by mail? And that is gaining a lot of traction, that conversation. A lot of Democrats favor it. The president has made clear he doesn't favor it because he thinks it will hurt his party. He, as he characteristically is, has been very blunt about that. But those are the types of changes that I think we're looking at, and we just don't know yet.
All right. And John asks, has there been any change in how the White House views Boeing and whether, what sort of aid Boeing should get, even aside from, the 737 MAX, has there been any sort of change in attitude as to whether they should get a bailout?
I mean, look, this remains a point of division within the administration. There are some people who are extremely concerned with the optics of doing this, given all of the concerns around Boeing. But there are others who believe that you have to go ahead. And frankly, where the president falls down on this, I'm not entirely sure. There are people who believe that you have to go ahead because it like airlines will struggle to stay afloat. So I can't speak to what that will ultimately end up looking like.
Got it. Kumar asks, what are you hearing about any sort of flight cancellations, given that the president had sort of raised the issue of quarantines for places like New York? Is there any sense, or is there any talk about any sort of greater isolation efforts, cutting off?
Yeah, no, it's an excellent question. The president yesterday was asked a question about flights, and what he said was he's looking at possibly grounding flights between coronavirus hotspots. I think that once you're allowing for that, you are allowing for the possibility that there will be greater curtailing of flights around the country. So that is very much an open question.
All right. And Alicia's asking, what sort of role is the military taking here, just in terms of dealing with logistics and procurement? There's already the Navy ship that's gotten into New York, but is there any sense that the Pentagon will step up or take any sort of increased role in the coronavirus response?
I think it's going to be a wait and see, and I think that we're still in the phase where you have the military not just sending ships like the Comfort to New York, which again is not it can't contain the virus. It can become a petri dish as well, but it can treat people. But you have members of the military who are getting sick, and so they are dealing with this on their own as well internally within the department. I think that it remains to be seen what more the military will do. This next month is going to be very, very, very revealing about what the next 6 months will look like. A lot is riding on the next 3 weeks, and that relates as well to what the military does.
Got it. Then Andrew, this is a question for you. What do you make about sort of the different GDP and unemployment estimates from Wall Street? And what are some of the good ideas that you're hearing from the business community about what more can be done to help the economy?
Well, look, I think you're looking at wide variations on some of these estimates, anywhere from 10% unemployment, which is ultimately what today's numbers almost imply, to 30, 40 plus percent unemployment in the United States. And I think there's a real question as to, again, the duration of this. I think that everything rides on duration. Whether you believe this is a 3-month or 2 or 3 month episode, or you think this is much longer. And that turns it again from a solvency story, a liquidity story, to a solvency story. What's a liquidity problem today can become a solvency problem tomorrow for so many of these businesses. And I think that's the fundamental question. The business community, look, most investors, dare I say, are professional optimists. That you have to be optimistic to be in the business for the most part. There are some famed short sellers out there, but as you know, as Maggie was reporting, even around the issue of where the president was on the Easter day, on trying to set an Easter deadline, and even pushing it out farther, to some degree, that's from the pressure that he's hearing from the business community. That's, you know, repeatedly saying to him, we got to get back to business. You need to do a different calculation. So one of the things the business community is saying all the time is that there's a different calculation that should be done. And dare I say, it's not strictly about health and lives. It's about the economic health of the country. And some of them then take that argument and even turn it into an argument about the health of people, which is to say, I think we talked about a little bit on the call last week, the idea that after financial crises, or in the aftermath of financial crises, there are demonstrable health impacts as well. Whether it be depression, whether there be, you know, what they call deaths of despair, and you know, we've talked about, you know, the opioid crisis and things like that. So there are real health impacts, which, you know, I think there's people in the business community that want to demonstrate to the president that those are greater than what's happening now. I'm not sure that's true or accurate, but nonetheless, I think that's part of the debate that's taking place. So I think right now, I don't believe that the market, if you will, I think the market believes that we are back to some semblance. I don't want to say normal, but some kind of people are going back to work. They might be going to certain types of restaurants. They're probably not going to, probably not getting on airplanes necessarily, or going to sporting events and things like that. But people, I think the market today still thinks that is something that's happening in late May, early June. As you know, because we've talked about it before in the newsletter and on this call, I think that if you listen to the health experts, it sounds like almost invariably it has to be longer than that.
We have an interesting question from an anonymous participant. Given the high unemployment numbers, what is the administration's position on corporate foreign workers, or you know, many of whom I guess are still working? Is there any possibility that they'd be required to leave, you know, as the unemployment numbers rise, or is there any talk in the administration about what will happen to them?
Michael, I'm sorry, forgive me because you faded out for 1 second. Their position on which kind of workers?
Just foreign workers who are here, you know, like
it's funny you asked that. This came up last night on Fox News on the opening of Tucker Carlson's show, which the president watches very carefully. And Tucker Carlson has become a voice that he listens to a lot. And Carlson addressed this issue, which is that so far there is no effort to try to curtail foreign workers. And he was suggesting that ought to be taken as a move, because there will be so many American job seekers who are hurting over the next couple of months. The fact that it came from Tucker Carlson suggests to me that you're going to hear the president float this and see what happens over the next couple of weeks. I would be a little surprised if his corporate friends, the president's corporate friends, tell him that this is a wise idea. I think that they will object to it, and I suspect that's going to be a voice that wins with him. But this is a discussion that you're now seeing emerge within the administration, and it's unclear where it heads.
Hey, Maggie, just a quick follow-up. You know,
Yeah.
in terms of the business people that you think that the president speaks to, that he trusts, or at least that he listens to, who do you think that is today? Meaning, outside in CEO land, that he's talking to, that he says, okay, I care what that person actually thinks.
The top of any list is always Steve Schwartzman. Schwartzman was in on that meeting that the president held with executives a couple of weeks ago. the same day of his Oval Office address. And what the feedback that the president got back in that meeting was generally, we agree the media is really overdoing this. They're making a thing here, but there are certain moves that have to be made. There was a lot of playing to his ego. Schwartzman remains one of the people who the president listens to closely. On the other hand, Rupert Murdoch also remains somebody who the president listens to closely. And then there's just a smattering of other people whose calls he takes, but those are his true norths.
Got it. Moving somewhat laterally, Nathan asks whether, given that everyone is focused on the sort of direct coronavirus response, but is the administration weighing in at all on the Saudi-Russia oil price war, which seems to be having quite a big effect on the economy?
It is having a big impact, and other than the president has backed off, as you know, his stance that the cheap oil prices are great. I think that they would like to have a resolution. I don't think this is something that they want to be talking publicly about. So exactly where their stance is, other than that they'd like a resolution to it, isn't clear.
Got it. And then Jim asks just, is the White House worried about any sort of bigger issues about civil unrest, like say people running out of food or being hit hard? Just basically, is there the chance of some sort of greater social unrest that they seem to be worried about?
There is concern about it. It's not a concern that they voice very often, understandably, because I think they're worried that that talking about it, helps create a possibility of this. And certainly this is a president who thinks that the more that he openly talks about things, that they then get sort of born into existence. We're not there yet, but there is concern about what this looks like with months on end of society being completely upended.
Okay. I have a final question for Maggie, and then we're going to wrap it up, which is this, Maggie. The president's brand has long been about America first. This idea that manufacturing needs to come back to the United States, that he's going to change immigration to be more inward focused, less about globalization, more inward. That's been the idea, and you even hear it in some of the press conferences in the past couple of days. How do you think that changes or plays out, not just with this administration, but in Washington over the next decade, frankly? Because it does feel like this pandemic has really shifted the entire landscape in many, many ways.
It's an excellent question. It is in many ways the question, and I don't have a great answer for it. Some of it depends, obviously, on whether the president gets another term, right? His style would be very different than Joe Biden's, for instance. Joe Biden is obviously not definitively the nominee, but he's certainly the likely nominee. I think that there are going to be real ramifications to this. I think that the president is going to, over the next couple of months, say that he was right. I think you're going to hear a louder conversation about drug imports, about why so much of the medicine that treats Americans is made overseas and brought over. Again, how durable that is, I'm not sure, because the reality is that as much as the president talks about not being a globalist, there are aspects of his administration that rely pretty strongly on globalism. In terms of his brand, though, I think, and really you have to separate out the brand, meaning the things he says publicly and tries to identify with some of the actions the administration takes. On the branding front, I think you're going to hear him continue to talk about why this proves that he was right. And how much of a ripple effect that has going forward is anyone's guess. I know you're hearing this in my answers a lot. I am so reluctant to forecast out what the post-coronavirus world looks like, because we have never gone through something like this, and we are so upended in such a short amount of time that I think it is dangerous to project past the next couple of weeks. Okay.
Well, we want to thank Maggie Haberman for joining us. Your coverage has been awesome, and we're privileged to have you. So thank you. Michael, thank you. We want to thank all of our listeners and everybody who's been sending in questions. Thanks for the great questions. We will do this again next week. and we'll let you know who's on tap. We'll also make a replay available, as we said at the beginning of this conversation, in the newsletter on NewYorkTimes.com and on social as well later today and tomorrow. And if you have feedback, we love it. We're trying to improve every week. DealBook@nytimes.com is the address. Please stay safe and healthy, everybody. We'll see you next week. Thanks again.